The alarm on my console screamed before I even understood why. I am Cyril Dovanek, third attaché to the Cerulean Assembly, and in all my years of service I had never heard that particular tone before. It was the tone reserved for arrivals that broke every rule of approach we had ever written down. A single ship had entered our outer sensor net. Not a fleet. Not an envoy convoy with its careful escort of scout vessels and translator drones. One ship, alone, moving in a straight line toward the heart of assembly space, as if it owned the stars it crossed. I remember standing at the observation rail above the sensor floor, watching the technicians below argue in 3 different languages at once. The ship's transponder was broadcasting a single word, over and over, in a language our systems had only recently learned to parse. Earth. I had heard of the humans, of course. Everyone in the diplomatic corps had. They were a young species, discovered less than a lifetime ago by one of our long-range survey vessels that stumbled into their solar system by accident. What followed was not a first contact in the way our histories describe such things. It was a border dispute, a skirmish, brief and violent, along a contested mining colony neither side realized the other valued. The humans had not backed down. They had not sued for peace on our terms. They had fought, and fought hard, until both sides simply agreed to stop, exhausted and wary of each other in equal measure. Since then, humanity had been placed under what the Assembly called a period of observation, a polite word for quarantine. They were permitted no embassy, no seat at the table, no formal contact beyond the narrow diplomatic channel used to prevent another accidental conflict. We watched them from a distance, the way you might watch a fire you were not yet sure had gone out. And now, without warning, without the customary 6 months of preliminary correspondence, without so much as a formal request lodged through the proper channels, a single human warship was crossing into the most sacred space in galactic civilization, the Assembly Corps, the seat of government for over 4,000 member species. I remember turning to my superior, Ambassador Threl Yasenko, a Threnai elder, with silver markings along her throat, that pulsed faster when she was afraid. She was pulsing very fast that day. "Recall the perimeter fleet," she said, though her voice barely carried over the noise of the sensor floor. "Tell them not to fire unless fired upon. Just tell them to be ready." I asked her why she thought it necessary to prepare for conflict when the ship had made no aggressive maneuvers. She looked at me the way an elder looks at someone who has not yet lived long enough to understand fear properly. "Because they are not asking permission to arrive, Sorel. They already decided to come. That is not how anyone approaches this assembly. Not the Corveth, not the Alanthi, not even the old empires who remember when this chamber was young. Everyone asks. This ship simply announced. I did not understand her concern then. I understand it now, though understanding it did not make the memory any less difficult to carry. The ship, we later learned, was called the Halfway Point, a name so strange and unassuming that our translators initially rendered it into something closer to middle ground, assuming an error in the language matrix. It was not an error. Humans, it turned out, often named their vessels things that sounded almost like jokes, as if daring the universe to take them less seriously because of it. The Halfway Point did not slow as it crossed our outer defense grid. It did not respond to the standard hailing protocols we broadcast on every frequency known to interstellar law. It simply continued inward, past 3 separate checkpoints, past 2 full battle groups scrambled in a panic to intercept it, until it arrived in high orbit above the Assembly's central station, and stopped. Then, and only then, did it send a message. I was in the communications gallery when the message arrived, translated in real time by the same linguistic algorithms that had struggled for years to make sense of human speech patterns. The message was short. It requested a meeting, not a summit, not a formal audience with the appropriate weeks of preparation and protocol review. A meeting, scheduled for 2 hours from the time of transmission, as though the largest governing body in known space were an office the humans could simply walk into. The Assembly's senior council convened in an emergency session that I was fortunate, or perhaps unfortunate, enough to witness from the observation gallery reserved for junior staff. I watched delegates from species far older than humanity argue about how to respond. Some wanted to refuse the meeting outright, to send a clear signal that such behavior would not be tolerated from a quarantined species. Others, more cautious, pointed out that refusing might provoke exactly the kind of incident everyone had spent decades trying to avoid. In the end, fear of the unknown won over pride, as it often does when the unknown has already proven it can bite. The council agreed to the meeting. 2 hours, they decided, was enough time to prepare a response, though I suspect no one in that chamber truly believed 2 hours was enough time to prepare for what was coming. I was assigned, along with a dozen other junior staff, to assist with logistics for the human delegation's arrival. It was considered a minor posting, the kind of task given to attaches too inexperienced to be trusted with anything of real consequence. I did not know then that I would spend the rest of my career trying to explain to others what I saw that day. The docking bay reserved for the human shuttle was standard in every respect, built to accommodate vessels of 100 different configurations, from the segmented pods of the Alanthe to the pressurized spheres favored by the aquatic Corveni delegations. We had reviewed what limited technical data we had on human shuttle designs, expecting something utilitarian, perhaps even crude by assembly standards, given how young their spacefaring history was compared to our own. What descended through the bay's atmospheric shield was smaller than expected, sleek in a way that suggested function rather than display. Painted a color our sensors classified as matte gray, with faint blue trim along the hull seams, it landed with a precision that surprised the docking crew, settling onto its designated pad without a single correction from ground control. The ramp lowered, and I remember, even now, the strange silence that fell over the docking bay as we waited to see what would walk down it. A single figure emerged, not a delegation of advisors and translators and security escorts, as protocol demanded for any species addressing the assembly for the first time. One person, a woman, tall by human standards, with dark hair pulled back, and a uniform that bore no obvious rank insignia we could identify, though we would later learn it marked her as the captain of the vessel behind her. Her name, I learned later, was Captain Owen Marsh. I misremember it slightly even now, the syllables sitting strangely against my native tongue, but the name stayed with me because of how she said it herself, plainly, without embellishment, when the docking officer nervously asked for identification. "Captain Owen Marsh," she said. "Halfway point. I'm here for the meeting." That was all. No formal greeting exchanged according to the 14 recognized diplomatic customs used for first meetings between unfamiliar species. No offering, no ritual bow, no acknowledgement of the honor supposedly being extended to her by allowing entry into the assembly core. She simply walked forward, past the stunned docking crew, past the security escort that had been assigned to guide her, and asked, in a tone that suggested mild impatience rather than awe, where the meeting chamber was located. I was standing near the edge of the bay, close enough to see her face clearly. She did not look nervous. She did not look defiant either, not in the way our historical records describe defiance among species being evaluated for potential threat status. She looked, more than anything, bored, as though walking into the seat of galactic government alone, unarmed, and completely unescorted, was simply another item on a long list of tasks she intended to finish before the day ended. I fell into step some distance behind the security escort as they guided her toward the central corridor that would eventually lead to the assembly floor. It was not my assigned duty, but curiosity overruled protocol that day, and I was not alone in that failing. Several other junior staff trailed along at a respectful distance, drawn by the same strange magnetism that seemed to surround this single human woman walking through the heart of our civilization, as though she had walked these halls 1,000 times before. She did not look around with the wide-eyed wonder we had come to expect from newly contacted species encountering the scale of the assembly core for the first time. The soaring architecture, built to inspire humility in visitors from 100 worlds, seemed to draw only passing glances from her, the kind of look one gives to a building, while thinking about something else entirely. At one point, as we passed through the grand concourse, a stretch of corridor lined with statues commemorating the founding species of the assembly, one of the escort officers, a young Alanthe named Vec Korathis, attempted to explain the significance of the monuments. Captain Marsh listened politely for a moment, then asked a question that caught everyone off guard. "How many wars did it take to get all of you to agree on this place?" Vex stammered through an answer about the peaceful founding principles of the assembly. The the shared vision of cooperation between the first four member species. Captain Marsh nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they have decided not to argue a point they clearly do not believe. "Sure," she said, peaceful. We reached the outer doors of the assembly chamber sooner than I expected, though the walk had felt long, stretched thin by the strange tension that seemed to follow the captain like a second shadow. The doors themselves were enormous, carved from a crystalline alloy mined from the Threnai homeworld centuries ago, engraved with the founding charter of the assembly, in a script so old that only scholars could read it without assistance. Captain Marsh looked up at the doors for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked at the guard stationed beside them and asked if they opened automatically or if someone needed to push. I do not know why that small moment has stayed with me so clearly, years later, when so much else about that day has faded into the general blur of memory. Perhaps it was because it was the first sign, however small, that this human woman did not intend to be impressed by anything we showed her. Not the architecture, not the history, not the sheer accumulated weight of civilization that the assembly represented. She intended to walk through those doors, say what she came to say, and leave. The doors opened, drawn back by the chamber's automated systems, and beyond them lay the assembly floor itself, a vast circular amphitheater, ringed by tiered seating, that rose in concentric circles toward a domed ceiling, painted with a mural depicting the founding of galactic civilization. Thousands of delegates occupied those seats, representing every recognized species with a voice in assembly affairs, and every one of them turned to look as the doors opened. I was not permitted onto the floor itself, restricted instead to the observation gallery reserved for staff, but I had a clear view from above as Captain Marsh stepped through the threshold and paused, just for a moment, taking in the sheer scale of the chamber before her. For the first time since her arrival, I saw something shift in her expression. Not fear, not awe, exactly. Something closer to recognition, as though she were cataloging the room the way a soldier catalogs unfamiliar terrain before deciding how to move through it. Then she started walking again, down the long central aisle toward the speaker's platform at the chamber's heart, alone, unhurried, while 4,000 delegates from across the galaxy watched in a silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I did not know, standing in that gallery, that I was witnessing the first moments of something that would reshape the balance of power across known space. I only knew that something about the way this single human walked into a room built to overwhelm visiting species with its grandeur, and simply refused to be overwhelmed, felt like watching the first crack appear in a wall everyone had assumed was permanent. Ambassador Yasenko found me afterward, in the corridor outside the gallery, her silver markings still pulsing faster than I had ever seen them. She did not say much. She only asked me what I thought of the human captain, and when I admitted I was not entirely sure, she nodded slowly, as if that uncertainty confirmed something she had already suspected. "Neither am I," she said, "and that is what frightens me most." I did not understand the full weight of her words until later that day, when Captain Marsh reached the speaker's platform, turned to face the assembled delegates of the galaxy's oldest and most powerful institution, and began to speak without a single note of hesitation in her voice. Whatever she was about to say, I understood. Standing there in the gallery with my hands gripping the rail tighter than I realized, was going to change everything. I did not know yet how right I was. The chamber held its silence for a long moment after Captain Marsh reached the speaker's platform. I have since read transcripts of 1,000 first addresses given by newly contacted species before the assembly, and every single one of them followed the same pattern. A greeting, an expression of gratitude for being permitted to speak, a careful, measured statement of intentions, phrased in language designed not to offend any of the thousands of cultures listening. Captain Marsh did none of this. She stood at the platform, hands resting loosely at her sides, and looked out across the tiered seating, the way someone looks across a room full of people they are mildly annoyed to be addressing. Then she spoke, and her voice carried through the chamber's acoustic design without any of the amplification devices other species typically required. "My name is Owen Marsh," she said. "I command the halfway point, currently in orbit above this station. I'm not here as a diplomat. I'm here because my government sent me to deliver a message, and I intend to deliver it exactly as written." A murmur passed through the tiers. the sound of thousands of translators working in overlapping frequencies to render her words into 100 different languages at once. I watched from the gallery as delegates leaned toward each other, exchanging glances that ranged from curious to visibly offended. The speaker of the assembly, an elder statesman of the Corvinai named Dol Naresh, rose from his seat at the chamber's head. He was ancient even by Corvinai standards, his skin a deep mottled blue that had faded to gray in patches along his throat, and his voice carried the particular authority of someone who had presided over first contacts with over 200 species during his long tenure. "Captain Marsh," he said, each word measured with careful diplomatic weight. "The Assembly welcomes representatives of newly observed species with great interest. However, protocol requires that formal address to this body be preceded by proper introduction of credentials and accompanied by a delegation appropriate to the significance of the occasion. You arrive alone, and without prior notice extending beyond a matter of hours. This is highly irregular." Captain Marsh nodded slowly, as if she had expected this exact response. "I understand it's irregular," she said. "My government is aware of that too. We decided the message was more important than the protocol." Speaker Aresh's throat markings darkened, a physiological response among the Corvinai that I had learned, during my studies, indicated controlled displeasure. And what message could possibly justify such a breach of custom? Captain Marsh reached into a pouch at her belt and withdrew a small data device, setting it on the platform's transmission pad without ceremony. The chamber's central display, a vast holographic projection visible from every seat, flickered to life above the speaker's platform, showing a simple star chart marked with a scattering of highlighted systems. "For the past 30 years," she said, "your assembly has classified my species as under observation. A polite word for quarantine. During that time, you've restricted our access to interstellar trade routes, denied our diplomatic requests for formal contact, and maintained a standing fleet presence along our border that your own records describe as, and I'm quoting directly, a necessary precaution against an unpredictable species." She let the words sit in the silence for a moment before continuing. "We've spent those 30 years being very patient," she said. "We've watched you deny membership applications to over a dozen other newly discovered species during that same period, always citing the same concerns. Insufficient cultural development, unproven diplomatic maturity, unpredictable behavior patterns, and we've noticed something interesting about the pattern." The star chart above her shifted, highlighting a cluster of systems near the assembly's outer boundary. "Every species you've denied membership to shares one thing in common," she said. "They're all technologically capable of eventually challenging the established power structure of this assembly. Every species you've welcomed with open arms shares another thing in common. They pose no threat to anyone's current position of influence." I watched the reaction ripple across the chamber, delegates shifting in their seats, some exchanging quiet words with their neighbors, others simply staring at the human captain with expressions I could not fully read from the gallery. Ambassador Yasenko, seated in the section reserved for the Threnai delegation, had gone very still. "That's a serious accusation, Captain Marsh," Speaker Aresh said, his voice carefully controlled despite the visible tension in his posture. "One that requires substantial evidence before this body would consider it credible." "I have the evidence," Captain Marsh said. "It's all public record, buried in 3 decades of assembly archives, that most member species never bother reading in full. My government did. We had 30 years with nothing else to do, while you decided whether we were dangerous enough to keep out or harmless enough to let in." She paused, and for the first time since she had begun speaking, something like genuine frustration crossed her features, quickly suppressed. "We're done waiting for that decision," she said. "We're not here to ask for membership anymore. We're here to inform you that Earth intends to establish full diplomatic and trade relations with any member species willing to engage with us directly, with or without this assembly's formal endorsement." The chamber erupted into noise. I had never witnessed anything like it. Thousands of delegates speaking at once, translators struggling to keep pace with the overlapping languages, the ordered calm of the assembly floor dissolving into something closer to chaos than I had believed possible within those ancient walls. Speaker Aresh raised a hand, calling for order, and it took nearly a full minute before the chamber settled enough for him to be heard again. "Captain Marsh," he said, and his voice had lost some of its measured calm. What you are describing amounts to a unilateral rejection of assembly governance structures that have maintained peace and stability across this region of space for over 3,000 years. Such an action, taken by a species with no formal standing within this body, would be considered a serious violation of interstellar law. With respect, Captain Marsh said, and I noted that her tone did not carry any actual respect at all. Your assembly has never recognized my species as having any standing to violate in the first place. You can't quarantine a species for 30 years, deny them a voice in the very laws you claim govern them, and then expect them to consider those laws binding. It was at this moment that another delegate rose from the tiers, a Corveth war minister whose name I would later learn was Dross Kalin, a broad-shouldered figure whose species had built their reputation on martial strength and a long history of aggressive territorial expansion during the Assembly's early centuries, before such expansion had been curtailed by treaty. Perhaps, Minister Kalin said, his voice carrying a note of open contempt that cut through the chamber's remaining murmur, the human captain forgets that her species was permitted to survive its first encounter with an Assembly member fleet, purely as a matter of mercy. The Corveth vessels that engaged your border colony 30 years ago could have ended your species' existence entirely, had our commanders chosen a different course of action. I felt the temperature of the room shift, though nothing physical had changed. Captain Marsh turned to face Minister Kalin directly, and for the first time since she had entered the chamber, I saw something in her expression that I can only describe, even now, as genuine amusement. "Is that the story your fleet tells?" she asked. "Because the story we tell is a little different. Your border fleet engaged an unarmed mining colony, and when we sent a response force, your commanders retreated, after losing 3 ships to a squadron that had never even seen an alien vessel before that day." Minister Kalin's expression darkened, his facial ridges flaring in a manner I recognized from Corveth physiology as a sign of significant agitation. "You dare suggest the Corveth fleet retreated from a lesser force?" "I don't suggest it," Captain Marsh said. "I state it as fact, because it happened, and both our militaries have the records to confirm it. Your government just doesn't like talking about that part." The chamber had gone quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than before, tense and expectant, the kind of silence that settles over a room when everyone present understands that something significant is about to happen, but no one is entirely sure what shape it will take. Minister Kalin stepped down from the tiered seating, moving toward the central floor with the deliberate, measured stride of someone accustomed to commanding attention through physical presence alone. He was easily twice Captain Marsh's height, his frame built for a species that had evolved on a heavier gravity world, every visible muscle suggesting strength that no human, however capable, could hope to match in a direct physical contest. "Perhaps," he said, stopping a short distance from the speaker's platform, "the human captain would benefit from a reminder of what true strength looks like, before she makes further claims about matters she does not fully understand." I did not know, in that moment, that Minister Kalin was invoking one of the oldest and most dangerous customs recognized within Assembly law, a ritual challenge reserved for moments of severe diplomatic insult, one that had not been formally invoked within the Assembly chamber itself in over 2 centuries. I only knew, watching from the gallery, that the air in the chamber had changed, and that Ambassador Yasenko, still seated among the Threnai delegation, had risen halfway from her seat with an expression of open alarm. Captain Marsh looked up at Minister Kalin, unbothered by the height difference between them, unbothered by the obvious physical advantage he possessed, and simply asked, "Is that a challenge, Minister?" "It is," he said. "Then I accept," she said, without a moment's hesitation, and the chamber fell into a silence so complete that I could hear the faint hum of the ventilation system echoing through the vast space above us. I remember gripping the observation rail hard enough that my fingers ached afterward. I remember Ambassador Yasenko's silver markings pulsing so rapidly they had become a near-constant glow. I remember thinking, with a clarity that surprised me even in the moment, that whatever happened next was going to matter far more than anyone in that chamber currently understood. Speaker Aresh attempted to intervene, reminding both parties that the ritual challenge carried consequences neither side should accept lightly, that it had not been invoked in centuries, precisely because the Assembly's founders had recognized how easily such contests could spiral beyond diplomatic control. Minister Kalin waved away the concern with the confidence of someone who believed the outcome was already decided. Captain Marsh said nothing at all, simply watching the War Minister with an expression of calm, patient calculation that I would only fully understand the meaning of once the contest actually began. The chamber's automated systems, ancient but still functional, began reconfiguring the central floor to accommodate the ritual space required for such a challenge, clearing the platform and surrounding seating to create an open arena at the heart of the Assembly's most sacred hall. I watched the transformation happen with a growing sense of dread, uncertain whether I was about to witness the death of the first human ever to stand before the Assembly, or something else entirely, something I had no framework yet to understand. Ambassador Yasenko found her way to my side in the gallery, her breath coming faster than usual, her silver markings still glowing with an intensity I had never seen from her before. "This should not be happening," she said quietly, more to herself than to me. "No one invokes the challenge ritual anymore. No one has needed to in generations." I asked her what the ritual actually entailed, and she explained, in a voice tight with barely restrained anxiety, that it was a contest of endurance and combat skill, stripped of weapons and technology, designed centuries ago to settle disputes between species too proud to back down through diplomatic means alone. It was rarely fatal, she assured me, though rarely was not the same as never, and the physical disparity between Minister Kalin and Captain Marsh was significant enough that I could see the concern in her eyes, even as she tried to reassure me otherwise. Below us, the arena finished forming, a wide circular space bounded by a shimmering containment field that would prevent either combatant from leaving the contest area until the ritual concluded. Minister Kalin removed the outer layers of his formal attire, revealing a frame built for physical dominance, muscle layered over muscle, in a manner that made clear exactly why the Corvette had built their reputation on martial strength. Captain Marsh removed her uniform jacket, folding it with unhurried precision and setting it aside on the speaker's platform, revealing nothing particularly remarkable underneath, simply the frame of someone who appeared physically fit, but entirely unremarkable by comparison to the War Minister standing across from her. I remember thinking, in that moment, that I was about to watch someone die for the crime of speaking honestly, in a room that had not wanted to hear the truth. I was wrong, but I would not understand how wrong until the contest actually began, and by then, the entire chamber had already begun to understand something that would take the rest of the galaxy considerably longer to accept. The containment field hummed to life around the arena, a faint shimmer of golden light that marked the boundary neither combatant could cross until the ritual concluded. Speaker Aresh, standing at the edge of the arena with the weary expression of someone forced to preside over an event he clearly wished had never been invoked, raised his voice to explain the rules to the assembled chamber, though I suspect every delegate present already understood them intimately. The contest would continue until one participant yielded, or until one participant could no longer continue. No weapons, no technology beyond what the body itself provided. First blood did not end the contest, a detail that made my stomach tighten uncomfortably as I watched from the gallery above. Only submission or incapacitation would bring it to a close. Minister Kalin rolled his shoulders, the motion casual, almost bored, the posture of someone who had fought 100 contests like this one and expected the 101st to unfold exactly the same way. Captain Marsh stood opposite him, weight settled evenly, hands loose at her sides, watching him with an expression I can only describe as clinical, the look of someone assessing a problem rather than facing a threat. I leaned toward Ambassador Yasenko and asked, quietly, whether there was any way to stop this before it began. She shook her head slowly, her silver markings still glowing faint with tension. "The challenge was issued and accepted before witnesses," she said. "To stop it now would violate ritual law in a way that would insult every species present. There is no path backward from here, only forward." Speaker Aresh gave the signal, and the contest began. Minister Kalin moved first, closing the distance between them with a speed that surprised me, given his considerable size. I had expected, based on nothing more than instinct and the visible disparity in strength, that the contest would end quickly, that Captain Marsh would be overwhelmed within the first exchange and forced to yield before serious harm occurred. That is not what happened. Captain Marsh moved aside at the last possible moment, a small shift of her body that let the War Minister's charge pass harmlessly through the space she had occupied a heartbeat earlier. It was not a dramatic evasion, nothing that would have looked impressive in isolation, but the economy of the movement struck me even from the distance of the gallery. She had not wasted a single unnecessary motion. Minister Kalen turned, recovering quickly, and pressed forward again, this time with a series of strikes clearly meant to overwhelm, through sheer force and speed combined. Captain Marsh absorbed the first blow on a raised forearm, a motion that visibly cost her something, her jaw tightening with the impact, but she did not fall back the way I expected. She stepped inward instead, closing the distance rather than retreating from it, and delivered a strike of her own that caught the War Minister across the ribs with enough force to make him grunt audibly, a sound that carried clearly through the silent chamber. The exchange that followed unfolded faster than I could fully track, strikes and counters trading back and forth across the arena floor, and I began to understand, watching it unfold, that this was not simply a contest of raw strength. Minister Kalen possessed strength in abundance, and every blow that connected clearly did significant damage, but Captain Marsh possessed something else entirely, a precision and control that seemed to compensate for the physical disadvantage in ways I had not anticipated. Ambassador Yasenko beside me had gone very quiet, her attention fixed entirely on the arena below. "She fights like someone who has done this before," she murmured, "many times before." I did not understand the significance of her observation until later, when I had access to the full historical record on human military training, and learned that hand-to-hand combat training remained a standard component of human armed forces education, even in an age of advanced weaponry, a tradition maintained not out of necessity, but out of a stubborn cultural insistence that soldiers understand how to fight, even when every other tool had failed them. It was a philosophy that seemed almost quaint to species who had long since relegated physical combat to ceremonial contests and historical reenactments. It did not seem quaint watching it applied in real time against a Corvette War Minister, who had clearly expected an easy victory. The contest continued, and I watched Minister Kalen's confidence begin to erode, replaced by something closer to genuine frustration, as strike after strike failed to end the fight as quickly as his reputation suggested it should. He was landing blows, certainly, and I could see the visible toll they were taking on Captain Marsh, bruising already forming along her forearms where she had blocked strikes clearly meant to break bone, a thin line of blood at her temple from a glancing blow she had not fully avoided. But she kept moving, she kept absorbing what she could not avoid, and returning strikes of her own, with a patience that seemed almost unnatural, given the physical cost she was clearly paying. I realized, watching her, that she was not trying to win through a single decisive blow. She was wearing him down, methodically, the way water wears down stone, accepting damage in exchange for opportunities that a species built for explosive strength, rather than sustained endurance, might not be prepared to withstand. Minister Kalen's strikes began to slow, almost imperceptibly at first, then more noticeably as the contest stretched past the point where most ritual challenges within assembly history had concluded. His breathing, audible now even from the gallery through the chamber's acoustic design, had grown ragged, while Captain Marsh's remained controlled, measured, the breathing of someone who had trained specifically for endurance under exactly these conditions. I turned to Ambassador Yasenko and asked how long these contests typically lasted. She admitted, with visible unease, that she did not know, that no living member of the assembly had witnessed a full ritual challenge in generations, and that the historical records suggested most concluded within minutes, rather than the duration this one had already exceeded. "She is not fighting to win quickly," Yasenko said. "She is fighting to win completely. There is a difference, and I do not think Minister Kalen understood that difference when he issued the challenge." The War Minister, perhaps sensing the shift in momentum, attempted a final desperate assault, a series of strikes thrown with everything remaining strength he possessed, clearly hoping to end the contest through sheer overwhelming force before his endurance failed entirely. Captain Marsh met the assault not by retreating, but by stepping directly into it, absorbing the opening strikes on her guard while closing the distance he had been maintaining, until she was close enough that his considerable reach advantage became a liability rather than a strength. What followed happened quickly. a sequence of movements too fast and too precise for me to fully process in the moment, and when it concluded, Minister Kalen was on the arena floor, Captain Marsh's arm locked against his throat in a hold that clearly left him with only two options: submission or unconsciousness. The chamber had gone utterly silent. I do not believe a single sound was made across the entire vast space of the assembly floor, as everyone present processed what they had just witnessed. "Yield," Captain Marsh said, her voice carrying clearly despite her own labored breathing, "or I finish this." "Your choice, Minister." For a long moment, Minister Kalen said nothing, his pride visibly warring with the reality of his situation. Then, finally, in a voice stripped of all the confidence he had carried into the arena, he spoke a single word: "Yield." Captain Marsh released him immediately, stepping back with the same measured calm she had carried throughout the entire contest, and extended a hand to help him rise from the floor. He stared at the offered hand for a moment, clearly uncertain how to interpret the gesture after everything that had just occurred, before finally accepting it and allowing her to help him to his feet. "No hard feelings, Minister," she said, and there was something almost gentle in her tone now, a stark contrast to the controlled violence of moments before. "You fought well. You were just fighting the wrong opponent for what you were expecting." The containment field around the arena flickered and dissolved, and Speaker Aresh, his expression carrying an emotion I could not fully identify, something between shock and dawning apprehension, stepped forward to formally conclude the ritual according to assembly custom. But the chamber itself had already moved past formal custom into something else entirely. I could see it in the faces of the delegates around the tiered seating, in the way conversations had erupted again, quieter this time, more urgent, delegates leaning close to one another, with expressions of genuine alarm, rather than the earlier mixture of curiosity and mild offense. Ambassador Yasenko turned to me, her silver markings still glowing with an intensity that had not faded even as the contest concluded. "Do you understand what just happened, Sorel?" I admitted that I understood the surface of it, that Captain Marsh had won a contest she should not have been able to win against a physically superior opponent. Yasenko shook her head slowly. "That is not what happened," she said. "What happened is that a species we classified as primitive, unpredictable, and unfit for full membership just demonstrated, in front of the entire assembly, that our assessment of their capabilities has been catastrophically wrong, and if we were wrong about this, a simple contest of physical endurance, we must now ask ourselves what else we might be wrong about." I looked down at the arena floor, where Captain Marsh had retrieved her uniform jacket and was pulling it back on, unbothered by the bruising visible along her forearms, unbothered by the blood still trickling from the cut at her temple, standing in the center of the assembly's most sacred chamber, having just defeated one of its most respected military figures in single combat. She looked up toward the gallery, and for a brief moment, though I knew it was almost certainly coincidence given the distance involved, I felt certain her gaze passed directly over where I stood. Then she turned back toward the speaker's platform, retrieved the data device she had left there earlier, and addressed the chamber once more, her voice carrying the same calm, unhurried authority it had carried since the moment she first walked through those ancient crystalline doors. "I believe I was in the middle of explaining our position," she said, before we were interrupted. The chamber, still reeling from what it had just witnessed, offered no further interruption. And in that silence I understood, with a clarity that settled cold and certain in my chest, that the galaxy I had known that morning no longer existed in quite the same form it had before Captain Owen Marsh walked through those doors. What she said next would ripple across every member world of the assembly within hours, and it would take considerably longer for anyone to fully understand just how much had changed in that single afternoon. News of what had happened inside the assembly chamber did not stay contained within those walls for long. By the time Captain Marsh resumed her address, technicians in the communications gallery had already confirmed that fragments of the encounter, captured by delegate recording devices never intended for public distribution, were spreading across secure diplomatic networks throughout assembly space. Within hours, they would reach open civilian channels, and within a day, every inhabited world with access to interstellar communication would know that a lone human had defeated a Corvette war minister in ritual combat inside the sacred heart of galactic government. I spent that first evening in the records division, ostensibly assisting with the transcription of the day's session, though in truth, I found myself unable to focus on anything beyond replaying the contest in my mind, searching for some detail I had missed that might explain what I had witnessed. Ambassador Yasenko found me there, well past the hour when most staff had returned to their quarters, staring at a data terminal that had gone dark from inactivity some time earlier. "You should rest," she said, though she made no move to leave herself. "Tomorrow will bring more of this, not less." I asked her what she meant, and she settled into the chair beside mine with the weariness of someone who had spent the intervening hours fielding an endless stream of urgent communications from delegations across the chamber, all asking variations of the same question. "What do we do now?" "The Corveth delegation is demanding a formal inquiry into whether the challenge ritual was properly conducted," she said. "Not because they believe it was conducted improperly, but because they need some explanation for their defeat that does not require them to simply accept that a human bested their war minister through skill alone." Meanwhile, the Alanthi delegation has already requested an emergency session to discuss revising humanity's observation status, and I suspect they will not be the only ones. I asked whether this meant the assembly intended to grant humanity full membership, given what had happened. Yasenko's expression, already tired, grew more troubled still. "That is the question everyone is now asking themselves, and no one yet has an answer," she said, "because the deeper problem is not whether we grant membership. The deeper problem is what we do if we do not, and this species decides our approval was never something they needed in the first place." I did not fully understand the weight of her concern until the following morning, when I was assigned to accompany a small delegation of records officials tasked with reviewing historical data on human military and technological development, a task that had apparently been given low priority during the initial observation period and was now being conducted with considerable urgency. What we found, compiled from 30 years of quietly gathered intelligence that had largely gone unread by anyone with the authority to act on it, painted a picture considerably different from the one most assembly delegates had carried in their minds. Humanity, in the 3 decades since first contact, had not remained a static, contained threat, as the observation classification implied. They had expanded their settled systems by a factor that, when I first saw the number, I assumed was a data error. I remember sitting with records official Lyra Winthrop, a Threnai colleague only slightly senior to myself, as we cross-referenced the population growth figures against the resource allocation reports. "This cannot be correct," she said, running the same calculation a third time, as though expecting a different result. "No species expands at this rate without either significant technological support from an external source, or a level of internal cohesion that outpaces anything we have seen from a species this young." I suggested, somewhat nervously, that perhaps the humans had simply been more efficient than we assumed, and Lyra gave me a look that made clear she thought the suggestion inadequate to the scale of what we were seeing. "Efficient does not explain this," she said. "Look at their conflict records during this same period. Internal disputes, resource shortages during their early expansion phase, at least 2 documented incidents of open conflict between different human governing factions. By every measure we use to assess a species' capacity for sustained growth, humanity should have fractured or stagnated well before now. Instead, they expanded through it." We compiled our findings into a report that afternoon, one of dozens being hastily assembled across various divisions of the Assembly's records apparatus, all attempting to answer the same underlying question that had gone unasked for 30 years, simply because no one had believed it urgent enough to prioritize. What exactly had humanity been doing, unsupervised, during the entire period the Assembly had assumed it was safely contained behind an observation boundary that, I now understood, had never actually restricted anything beyond humanity's formal diplomatic access? Ambassador Yasenko summoned me to her office late that afternoon, along with several other members of her staff, to review the compiled findings before they were formally presented to the senior council. She looked, when I arrived, like someone who had not slept, her silver markings dulled to a faint, exhausted glow, rather than the bright pulsing tension I had grown accustomed to over the previous day. "The council convenes again in 3 hours," she said, without preamble. "I need to understand what we are walking into before we get there." I presented what Lyra and I had found, watching Yasenko's expression grow steadily grimmer as I worked through the population figures, the resource allocation patterns, the conflict records, that seemed to indicate a species capable of maintaining unified purpose, even through internal disagreement severe enough that, by any comparable metric from our own history, should have fractured them entirely. There is something else, I added, hesitant, because the finding felt significant enough that I wanted to be certain before presenting it. Their military doctrine. We have very limited direct data, given the observation restrictions, but what we do have suggests a level of adaptability that does not match any pattern we have seen from other species during comparable periods of early expansion. I explained what I meant, drawing on the brief combat records available from the initial border skirmish 30 years earlier, and comparing them against what limited additional data had trickled through diplomatic channels since. Where most species, when confronted with an unfamiliar military technology or tactic, required significant time to develop effective countermeasures, human forces during that initial conflict had apparently adjusted their approach within a matter of days, incorporating unfamiliar Corvette weapon signatures into their defensive planning almost as quickly as the weapons themselves had been deployed against them. It is as though they treat every new threat as simply another problem to be solved, I said, rather than a fundamental challenge to how they understand warfare itself. Yasenko was quiet for a long moment, staring at the compiled reports spread across her desk display. "Do you know what troubles me most about all of this, Cyril?" she asked finally. I admitted I did not. "It is not that humanity is dangerous," she said. "Many species are dangerous, in one respect or another. It is that they have been dangerous, quietly and consistently, for 30 years, while we congratulated ourselves on successfully containing a threat that was never actually contained. We assumed observation meant control. It meant nothing of the sort. It simply meant we chose not to look closely enough to see what was actually happening." She gathered the reports and rose from her desk, gesturing for the rest of us to follow as she made her way toward the council chamber, where the emergency session would soon convene. "The question the council must now answer," she said, as we walked, "is not whether humanity deserves membership in this assembly. It is whether this assembly has any meaningful leverage left to withhold it, given everything we have just learned about what this species has quietly become, while our attention was elsewhere." The council chamber, smaller and more intimate than the grand assembly floor where Captain Marsh had delivered her address the previous day, was already crowded with senior delegates by the time we arrived, the air thick with the particular tension that accompanies decisions no one present wants the responsibility of making. I was permitted to remain only as a staff attendant, seated along the chamber's outer wall with the other junior officials, but I had a clear enough vantage to watch the proceedings unfold. Speaker Aresh opened the session with visibly less composure than he had carried into the assembly floor the day before, his blue skin mottled with patches of gray that seemed to have spread further overnight. A physical manifestation, I suspected, of stress that even his considerable age and experience could not fully mask. "We convene," he said, "to determine the Assembly's formal response to yesterday's events, and to the broader question those events have raised regarding humanity's status within this body. I will note, before we begin, that the human delegation has requested to observe this session remotely, a request I have granted, given the extraordinary circumstances." A murmur passed through the chamber at this announcement, and I understood immediately what it meant. Captain Marsh, or whoever among the human delegation was monitoring the proceedings, would hear every word spoken in a session that had traditionally been conducted with the assumption of complete privacy from any party whose status was under discussion. It was, I realized, one more small break from established custom, one more sign that the old rules were no longer being followed exactly as written. Minister Kalin, present despite the visible bruising still marking his features from the previous day's contest, rose first to speak, and I braced myself for what I assumed would be a demand for retribution, or at least formal censure against the human delegation for the humiliation he had suffered. What he said instead surprised nearly everyone in the chamber, myself included. "I have spent the night reviewing the historical data my staff compiled regarding human capability," he said, his voice carrying none of the contempt it had held the previous day, replaced instead by something closer to grim acknowledgement. "I do not believe further hostility toward this species serves the Corvette people, or this assembly. I was defeated by a warrior more skilled and more disciplined than I anticipated, and I would be a poor commander if I allowed pride to prevent me from acknowledging that reality clearly to this council. The chamber fell silent at this admission, and I saw Ambassador Yasenko's expression shift, something like cautious relief passing briefly across her features, before settling back into careful neutrality. The question before us, Minister Kalin continued, is not whether we can afford to admit humanity to this assembly. It is whether we can afford the consequences of continuing to exclude them, now that we understand more fully what they have quietly become, while under our observation. I do not believe we can. Other delegates rose in turn, some echoing Minister Kalin's assessment, others raising concerns about the precedent such a rapid reversal of policy might set, still others simply asking, with increasing urgency, what exactly the Assembly's options actually were at this point, given that humanity's delegation had made clear, through Captain Marsh's own words the previous day, that they no longer considered Assembly approval a prerequisite for establishing relations with individual member species. I listened to hours of debate that afternoon, delegates from every corner of Assembly space weighing in with perspectives shaped by their own species' histories and priorities, and I began to understand something that I suspect every delegate present had already privately concluded, even if few were willing to state it plainly before the full council. The Assembly's power had always rested on a kind of collective agreement, an understanding among member species, that cooperation within this shared framework served everyone's interests better than acting independently. That agreement had never truly been tested by a species with both the capability and the apparent willingness to simply walk away from it entirely, to pursue its own path regardless of whether the Assembly chose to grant its approval. Humanity, it seemed, was exactly such a species, and no one in that chamber, for all their accumulated wisdom and centuries of diplomatic experience, seemed entirely certain how to respond to a challenge the Assembly's founding principles had never actually anticipated. As the session finally concluded, with no formal resolution reached beyond an agreement to reconvene the following day, I found myself walking beside Ambassador Yasenko through the quiet corridors, leading away from the council chamber, both of us weighed down by the same unspoken understanding. We spent 30 years deciding whether humanity was ready for us, she said quietly, more to herself than to me. It seems we should have spent that time deciding whether we were ready for them instead. I did not have an answer for her. I do not believe anyone in the assembly that evening truly did. And somewhere above the station, in orbit aboard the halfway point, I imagined Captain Marsh receiving reports of the council's indecision with the same patient, unhurried calm she had carried through every moment since her arrival, already anticipating exactly how this would unfold, because her government, it was becoming increasingly clear, had spent 30 quiet years anticipating precisely this moment. The days that followed the council's indecisive session brought a kind of quiet chaos to the assembly corps that I had never witnessed in all my years of service. It was not the loud, visible chaos of conflict or open dispute, but something quieter and, in its own way, far more unsettling. Delegations that had barely acknowledged one another during ordinary assembly business suddenly found themselves in urgent private conversations. Trade ministers who had spent years negotiating the same tired agreements over resource allocation between neighboring systems were now quietly rewriting entire proposals, each one racing to secure some advantage before their neighbors could do the same. I understood, within a few days, exactly what was happening. Captain Marsh's message, delivered so plainly before the full assembly, had not been an idle threat. Human diplomatic vessels, small and unassuming compared to the grand ceremonial convoys the assembly typically used for such purposes, had begun quietly visiting individual member systems, bypassing the assembly's central authority entirely, offering bilateral trade agreements and technology exchanges directly to any government willing to engage. Ambassador Yasenko called me into her office on the fourth day after the council session, and I found her studying a series of reports with an intensity that suggested whatever they contained had significantly altered her assessment of the situation. The Vesrai have signed an agreement, she said, without looking up as I entered. Direct trade access to 3 of their outer systems in exchange for human medical technology their own researchers have apparently been unable to replicate independently. The Threnai Homeworld Council is now debating whether to pursue a similar arrangement before the opportunity passes us by entirely. I asked how the Assembly's Central Trade Authority was responding to individual member species negotiating separately with a non-member entity in this manner. Yasenko's expression carried the particular weariness of someone who had spent considerable time already contemplating exactly this question. "Poorly," she said. "There is no existing mechanism to prevent it. The Assembly's authority over interspecies trade has always rested on member species, choosing to route their agreements through the central framework, because doing so served their interests better than acting independently. That calculation appears to be shifting rapidly, now that a species outside the framework entirely is offering terms individual governments find more attractive than anything the Assembly's own bureaucracy has managed to produce in generations." I asked what this meant for the ongoing question of humanity's formal membership status, and Yasenko set down the report she had been reviewing, finally meeting my eyes directly. "I suspect it means the question is becoming less relevant with each passing day," she said. "Why would humanity seek membership in an institution whose primary function, from their perspective, appears to be slowing down agreements they can negotiate faster and more favorably on their own terms? We are no longer the gatekeepers they need to satisfy. We are, at best, a convenient forum for coordination they may or may not continue to find useful." It was during this period of quiet upheaval that I was assigned a task I had not expected, one that would give me a far closer view of the unfolding situation than my junior status typically warranted. Ambassador Yasenko, citing my prior involvement in the initial reception and my demonstrated attention to detail in the historical review that had followed, requested that I be assigned as a liaison attendant to a small diplomatic delegation being sent to formally engage with the human delegation aboard the halfway point, in an attempt to better understand humanity's actual intentions before the Assembly Council reconvened to finalize its position. I confess I approached the assignment with considerable apprehension. The image of Captain Marsh defeating Minister Kalin in ritual combat had not faded from my memory, and though I understood intellectually that the delegation's purpose was diplomatic rather than confrontational, some instinctive part of me remained wary of proximity to a species capable of such controlled, methodical strength. The shuttle ride up to the halfway point was brief, and I spent most of it reviewing what limited additional information had been gathered about the ship itself, which appeared, despite its unassuming exterior, to be equipped with defensive and sensor capabilities considerably more sophisticated than its size suggested. I mentioned this observation to Ambassador Yasenko, who was leading our small delegation personally, and she nodded with the tired acknowledgement of someone who had already reached similar conclusions. "They do not advertise their capabilities," she said. "I suspect that is deliberate. A species that wished to intimidate would arrive with an obvious show of force. Humanity arrived with a single ship and a single unarmed representative, and let the substance of their capability speak for itself only when directly challenged. I find that considerably more concerning than an overt display would have been." We were received aboard the halfway point, not by Captain Marsh herself, who I later learned was occupied with a separate set of negotiations occurring simultaneously with a delegation from the Alanthi homeworld, but by a diplomatic officer named Priya Ashworth, a woman of perhaps middle age by human standards, whose manner carried a warmth notably absent from Captain Marsh's controlled composure during the assembly session. "Ambassador Yasenko," she said, greeting our delegation at the airlock with what appeared to be genuine welcome, rather than the careful formality I had expected. "Thank you for coming aboard. I know this is unusual, given how things have unfolded over the past few days." Yasenko offered the traditional Threnai greeting, a slight bow with hands crossed at the chest, and Officer Ashworth returned it with what I noted was a reasonably accurate approximation, suggesting she had taken the time to study our customs in preparation for this meeting, a small courtesy that struck me as notable, given how little courtesy had characterized the human delegation's initial approach to the assembly itself. We were led through the ship's interior, which I found, contrary to my expectations, to be considerably more comfortable and lived in than the utilitarian military vessel I had anticipated. There were small personal touches throughout, framed images, a modest collection of plants growing under artificial light in a communal area, details that spoke of a crew that had spent considerable time aboard this vessel and had made genuine efforts to make it feel like something more than a simple transport. Officer Ashworth guided us to a small conference room, where several other members of the human delegation were already present, and it was here that our discussions began in earnest, considerably less formal than the assembly floor proceedings, though no less consequential for it. "I want to be direct with you, Ambassador," Officer Ashworth said, once introductions had concluded and refreshments, an unfamiliar hot beverage that I found surprisingly pleasant, had been offered. "Captain Marsh's approach to the assembly was deliberate, and I understand it has caused considerable disruption." That was not an accident, and I do not think it would be honest of me to pretend otherwise. Yasenko studied her for a long moment before responding. "Then perhaps you could help us understand the intention behind it," she said. "Because from our perspective, it has created considerable uncertainty, and uncertainty of this magnitude tends to produce instability that serves no one's interests well." Officer Ashworth nodded, as though she had anticipated this exact concern. 30 years, Ambassador," she said. "That is how long my people waited for a formal response to repeated diplomatic requests that were, at best, acknowledged with polite non-answers, and at worst, simply ignored entirely, while your assembly quietly maintained fleet deployments along our border that your own internal records describe as precautionary measures against potential aggression. We did not choose the observation status you assigned us. We simply endured it, because the alternative, open conflict with an institution controlling access to the vast majority of known interstellar trade and diplomatic relationships, seemed considerably worse." She paused, folding her hands on the table before continuing. "But 30 years is a long time to wait for a door that never opens," she said. "At some point, a species has to decide whether to keep waiting politely or to simply walk through the wall instead. We chose the wall." I found myself unexpectedly moved by the plainness of this explanation, though I could see Ambassador Yasenko weighing it with the careful skepticism of someone whose entire career had been built on recognizing when diplomatic language concealed less generous underlying motives. "And your ultimate intention," Yasenko said, "assuming this council reconvenes and grants formal membership status, as now seems increasingly likely, given the pace of independent agreements your government has been securing. What would humanity actually want from that membership, given how effectively you appear to be achieving your objectives without it?" Officer Ashworth's expression grew more thoughtful. "Honestly, Ambassador, I am not certain we would want it at all, not on the terms currently structured," she said. "Full membership within your assembly, as I understand the governing charter, requires member species to accept binding council decisions on matters ranging from trade regulation to territorial boundaries to military deployment restrictions. My government has spent 30 years watching how those binding decisions get made, who benefits from them and who does not. We are not eager to subject our future to a voting structure that has consistently favored species who arrived earliest, regardless of whether their continued influence still serves the broader good." This admission, delivered with the same calm plainness that had characterized every human statement I had witnessed since Captain Marsh first walked through the assembly's crystalline doors, settled over our small delegation with considerable weight. I understood, listening to it, that we had perhaps been asking the wrong question entirely during the days of frantic council debate that had followed the ritual challenge. We had been asking whether humanity deserved membership. It had apparently never occurred to enough of us to ask whether humanity actually wanted it, on the terms we had spent centuries constructing for our own benefit. "What would you propose instead?" Yasenko asked, after a long moment of consideration. Officer Ashworth exchanged a brief glance with the other human delegates present before answering. "A relationship built on direct agreements between willing parties, rather than centralized approval from an authority we have no particular reason to trust with that responsibility," she said. "We are not opposed to cooperation, Ambassador. We are opposed to subordination dressed up as cooperation. There is a difference, and I think your assembly has spent so long assuming the two were the same thing that the distinction has become difficult for many of your delegates to even recognize." We spent several more hours aboard the halfway point that day, discussing various aspects of what a restructured relationship between humanity and individual assembly member species might look like, and I left with a considerably more nuanced understanding of the situation than I had carried aboard the shuttle that morning. It was not, as I had initially feared, a simple story of an aggressive newcomer seeking to dismantle an established order out of ambition or malice. It was something more complicated, a species that had been treated with suspicion and quiet exclusion for 30 years, and had finally decided, with the same methodical patience Captain Marsh had displayed in the ritual arena, that waiting for acceptance on someone else's terms was no longer a strategy worth pursuing. As our shuttle departed the halfway point that evening, Ambassador Yasenko sat in contemplative silence for much of the return journey, and it was only as we approached the assembly station itself that she finally spoke. "I have spent my entire career believing this assembly represented the best possible framework for cooperation between different species," she said quietly. "I am no longer certain that belief was ever entirely accurate, or whether it was simply the belief most convenient for those of us who benefited from the framework as it currently exists." I did not have a response for her. I was not certain, at that point, that I had fully formed my own opinion on the matter. But I understood, watching the assembly station grow larger in the shuttle's forward viewport, that whatever emerged from the Council's eventual decision would not simply resolve the question of humanity's status within our existing structures. It would likely reshape those structures themselves, in ways that none of us, for all our accumulated centuries of diplomatic experience, could yet fully anticipate. The Council reconvened 1 week after the ritual challenge, and this time, the chamber was filled beyond its usual capacity, delegates from every member species crowding into seats normally reserved for formal sessions of the entire assembly, rather than the smaller council body that typically handled matters of this nature. Word had spread that a final resolution would be proposed, and no one, it seemed, wished to be absent when it was decided. I was permitted, this time, a seat slightly closer to the main floor, a small courtesy extended to those of us who had participated in the direct engagement with the human delegation aboard the halfway point. From this vantage, I could see the proceedings with considerably more clarity than the distant observation gallery had previously afforded. Captain Marsh was present again, though this time she was joined by Officer Ashworth and 2 other members of the human delegation, whose names I had learned during our earlier meeting. A quiet, observant man named Daniel Okonkwo, who apparently served as the delegation's senior legal advisor, and a younger woman named Fiona Whitfield, whose role I understood to be primarily technical, tasked with addressing any questions regarding the specific nature of the technology exchanges humanity had already been negotiating with individual member species. Speaker Aresh opened the session with considerably more composure than he had managed during the previous emergency meeting, though I noted the gray patches along his throat had not receded in the intervening week, a lingering sign, perhaps, of the strain this entire situation had placed on him personally. "We convene," he said, "to formally address the Assembly's position regarding the human delegation's status, and regarding the broader question of how this body intends to respond to the pattern of independent agreements that have developed over the past week between individual member species and human representatives operating outside our established diplomatic framework." He gestured toward a data display that materialized above the council floor, showing a rapidly expanding network of connecting lines between human systems and no fewer than 17 separate assembly member worlds, each line representing a formal trade or technology agreement concluded within the span of a single week. "I will be candid with this council," Speaker Aresh continued, "in a manner that perhaps departs from the formal caution such proceedings typically demand. This body faces a choice that our founding charter never anticipated. We can attempt to formally sanction member species who have concluded these independent agreements, an action that would likely prove both practically difficult to enforce and diplomatically catastrophic, given the scale at which it has already occurred. Or we can acknowledge that the framework governing this assembly's authority requires reconsideration, in light of a species that has demonstrated both the capability and the will to operate effectively outside it." A murmur passed through the chamber, though it carried none of the shock that had characterized the reaction to Captain Marsh's initial address a week earlier. I understood, watching the delegates around me, that most had already privately reached similar conclusions during the intervening days, and Speaker Aresh's words simply confirmed what had become an increasingly unavoidable reality. Minister Kalin rose to speak, and I noted that his bearing, while still carrying the confident authority typical of Corveth military leadership, had shifted subtly since the ritual challenge, a quality I struggled to name until I recognized it as something closer to respect than the contempt he had displayed initially. "The Corveth people have a long tradition," he said, "of respecting strength when we encounter it, even when that strength is turned against our own interests. I do not believe humanity's approach to this assembly has been hostile, despite its unconventional nature. I believe it has been honest, in a manner that this body has perhaps grown unaccustomed to over centuries of careful diplomatic language, designed to obscure rather than clarify. I would rather negotiate honestly with a species I understand, than maintain a comfortable fiction of control over one I clearly do not. His statement seemed to shift something in the chamber's mood, and I watched several other delegates rise in turn, each offering their own assessment of the situation, most arriving at broadly similar conclusions, despite their varied perspectives. The assembly, it seemed, had reached a rare moment of consensus, though not the consensus anyone had anticipated a week earlier. It was not agreement on whether to grant humanity membership. It was agreement that the question of membership had, in practical terms, already been rendered largely moot by the pace of events that had unfolded independently of any formal assembly decision. Speaker Aresh eventually turned the floor over to Captain Marsh, inviting her to respond to the council's deliberations, and I watched her rise from her seat with the same unhurried composure she had displayed since her very first steps through the assembly's crystalline doors. "I appreciate the council's candor," she said. "I think it's worth being equally candid in return. My government did not come here seeking to dismantle this assembly, or to prove some point about human superiority through a contest that, frankly, I would rather not have been forced to accept. We came here because 30 years of polite exclusion had made clear that waiting for your approval was not going to produce results, and my government decided we had better uses for our patience." She paused, glancing briefly toward Officer Ashworth before continuing. "What we want, going forward, is straightforward," she said. "We want the freedom to build relationships with any species willing to engage with us honestly, on terms both parties find fair, without requiring the approval of a central authority that has, historically, not always acted in the interests of newer or smaller member species. That does not mean we oppose this assembly's existence. Cooperation between many parties can still serve everyone's interests, when it is built on genuine consent rather than centralized control. But we will not accept a framework that treats our participation as something to be granted or withheld at your discretion, based on criteria that seem to have shifted conveniently whenever our capabilities became inconvenient to certain established interests." The chamber remained quiet as she spoke, and I sensed, watching the assembled delegates, that her words carried a particular resonance for many of the smaller or more recently contacted species present, those who had perhaps experienced their own versions of prolonged, cautious observation before finally being granted whatever limited status the assembly's older, more established members had been willing to extend them. Speaker Aresh, after a long moment of consideration, addressed the council directly. "I propose, then, that this body formally acknowledge humanity's independent status, neither as a quarantined observation subject, nor as a full member bound by existing charter obligations, but as a recognized sovereign entity, with standing to negotiate bilateral agreements with any willing member species, without requiring prior assembly approval for such agreements to be considered valid under interstellar law." The proposal, unconventional as it was, found rapid support across the chamber, delegates voting in favor, with a speed that suggested most had already resolved themselves to this outcome well before the formal proceedings began. Within the hour, the measure passed with an overwhelming majority, a result that would have seemed unthinkable a mere week earlier, when humanity had still been classified as a primitive, potentially dangerous species requiring careful containment. Captain Marsh received the news with the same measured calm that had characterized her entire visit, offering neither triumph nor visible relief, simply a small nod of acknowledgement before addressing the chamber one final time. "On behalf of my government, I accept this recognition," she said. "I hope it marks the beginning of a relationship built on mutual respect, rather than the fear or condescension that characterized our previous interactions, but I want to be clear about one thing, for the benefit of every delegate in this chamber." She paused, and something in her tone shifted slightly, carrying a weight that had not been present in her earlier, more measured statements. "We did not come here to conquer, or to dominate, or to prove that we are somehow superior to every species in this room," she said. "We came here because we were tired of being underestimated, and because we believed, correctly as it turns out, that demonstrating our capabilities directly would accomplish more in a single afternoon than 30 years of patient diplomatic requests ever managed to achieve. I would ask this council to consider what that says about the framework you have built, and whether other species, less capable than mine of forcing this conversation through demonstration, might be waiting in quiet observation status right now, deserving of the same consideration we have just been granted, without needing to win a fight in your sacred chamber first to earn it. Her words settled over the assembled delegates with considerable weight, and I saw more than a few exchange uncomfortable glances, the kind that suggested her question had struck closer to an uncomfortable truth than many present were entirely prepared to acknowledge. Ambassador Yasenko, seated nearby, leaned close and spoke quietly enough that only I could hear. "She is right, Sorel," she said, "and I suspect that admission will trouble this assembly considerably longer than her initial arrival did." As the session drew toward its conclusion, and delegates began the slow process of departing the crowded chamber, I found myself reflecting on everything that had unfolded over the preceding week. What had begun as a single, unauthorized ship crossing into assembly space had, within the span of 7 days, fundamentally altered the balance of power across known civilization, not through conquest or force in any traditional sense, but through the simple, unwavering refusal of a single delegation to accept treatment they considered unjust, backed by the demonstrated capability to make that refusal meaningful. I did not yet know that this was not the conclusion of the story, but merely its turning point. The formal recognition granted that day would prove, in the months and years that followed, to be only the first of many ripples spreading outward from humanity's arrival, ripples that would eventually reach every corner of assembly space, and reshape relationships that had stood unchanged for centuries. But that evening, as I watched Captain Marsh depart the council chamber alongside her small delegation, unescorted and unhurried just as she had been upon her arrival, I understood that I had witnessed something genuinely historic. Not the beginning of a conquest, as some of the more fearful delegates had initially believed, but the beginning of a fundamental renegotiation of what cooperation between different species actually meant, conducted not through the careful diplomatic language the assembly had relied upon for centuries, but through plain honesty backed by demonstrated strength. It was, I would come to believe in the years that followed, exactly the kind of reckoning our comfortable institutions had needed, even if none of us had been prepared for how uncomfortable that reckoning would ultimately prove to be. 6 months passed before I saw Captain Marsh again, and in that time, the shape of the galaxy I had known my entire career had shifted in ways I was still struggling to fully comprehend. Humanity's newly recognized status as an independent sovereign entity, rather than a member bound by traditional assembly obligations, had produced consequences that rippled outward far beyond the initial wave of trade agreements that had prompted the Council's decision in the first place. Other species, watching how effectively humanity had negotiated its own terms, began quietly requesting reviews of their own standing within the Assembly's traditional framework. The Vesrai, whose early trade agreement with humanity had proven remarkably successful for both parties, formally petitioned for a similar independent status, arguing that their own 3 centuries of loyal assembly membership had produced comparatively modest benefits, next to what a handful of months of direct negotiation with humanity had already delivered. The Alanthi followed shortly after, then 2 smaller species from the outer territories whose names I had, until that point, barely encountered in my career. Ambassador Yasenko, whose position within the Threnai diplomatic corps had grown considerably more prominent given her direct involvement in the events surrounding humanity's arrival, found herself increasingly consumed by the task of helping to draft what the Council had begun calling the Renewed Charter, an attempt to restructure the Assembly's governing framework in a manner that acknowledged the new reality Captain Marsh's arrival had forced into being. I had been promoted, somewhat to my own surprise, to serve as a senior aide within this effort, a position that placed me in regular contact with delegations from across known space, all grappling with the same fundamental question that had first been raised in that crowded council chamber 6 months earlier. What did cooperation actually mean when the old assumptions about hierarchy and centralized authority could no longer be taken for granted? It was during a diplomatic reception marking the formal signing of the Renewed Charter's preliminary framework that I encountered Captain Marsh once more, standing near the edge of a gathering that had drawn representatives from nearly every species now party to the ongoing negotiations. She looked, if anything, more relaxed than I remembered from our first encounter, though the same watchful calm remained evident in the way she observed the crowd around her. "Attaché Dovenek," she said, when I approached to offer the traditional greeting appropriate to the occasion. "I remember you from the gallery, that first day. You looked like you thought the ceiling was about to come down." I admitted that the observation was not entirely inaccurate, and she offered something close to a genuine smile, the first I had seen from her since her arrival. "For what it's worth," she said. "I wasn't entirely certain it wouldn't, either. Walking into a room like that, alone, betting everything on the idea that honesty backed by strength would accomplish more than 30 years of patient waiting had managed. It was not a comfortable gamble, even if I didn't let it show." I asked her, since the opportunity had presented itself and I found myself genuinely curious after months of studying the ripple effects of her arrival, whether she had anticipated the scale of change that single afternoon would ultimately produce. She considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I hoped for it," she said. "I did not fully expect it. My government sent me with a fairly narrow mandate, honestly. Establish that we would no longer accept quarantine status, demonstrate that we could not simply be dismissed or contained, and open direct channels for trade and diplomacy with any species willing to engage. Everything else, the broader restructuring, the other species petitioning for similar recognition, that emerged from decisions your assembly made afterward, not from anything we specifically planned." She paused, looking out over the gathered delegates, a mixture of species whose governments had, 6 months earlier, occupied wildly different positions within the assembly's traditional hierarchy, now negotiating as considerably more equal partners than the old framework had ever permitted. "I think that's the part people misunderstand when they tell this story," she said. "It wasn't really about humanity proving we were strong enough to demand respect. It was about demonstrating that your entire system had been built on an assumption that strength needed to be demonstrated at all, before respect could be extended. Once that assumption cracked, for us, it became a lot harder for anyone to pretend it should hold for everyone else." I found myself reflecting, in the weeks that followed that conversation, on how accurately her words captured the transformation I had witnessed unfold across the assembly during those 6 months. The old assembly had operated on a careful, unspoken hierarchy, where established species maintained influence and newer species waited patiently for gradual acceptance, always aware that their standing remained conditional on the goodwill of those who had arrived first. Humanity's refusal to accept that conditional status, backed by the plain fact of their demonstrated capability, had not simply carved out an exception for themselves. It had exposed the arbitrary nature of the entire system to species who had spent generations assuming it was simply the natural order of things. The renewed charter, when it was finally ratified some months later, did not abolish the assembly entirely, as some of the more anxious early reports circulating through public channels had speculated it might. Instead, it transformed the institution's fundamental character, shifting from a body with centralized authority over member species' external relations toward something closer to a genuine forum for voluntary cooperation, where individual species retained full sovereignty over their own diplomatic and trade decisions, choosing to coordinate through the Assembly's shared infrastructure, because doing so provided genuine mutual benefit, rather than because failing to do so risked exclusion or sanction. It was, I came to understand, through countless hours spent drafting and revising the Charter's language alongside delegates from a dozen different species, exactly the kind of relationship Officer Ashworth had described to us aboard the halfway point during that first tense meeting so many months earlier. Cooperation, built on genuine consent, rather than subordination dressed up in the comfortable language of shared governance. I did not see Captain Marsh again after that reception, though I followed news of her career with interest over the years that followed, learning that she had eventually returned to active service, commanding human border patrols along territories that had, in the intervening time, expanded considerably as humanity established formal relationships with an increasing number of neighboring species. The halfway point, I was told, remained in service for many years afterward, a vessel that had, through a single unprecedented voyage, fundamentally altered the trajectory of galactic civilization. Ambassador Yasenko retired from active diplomatic service some years later, though she remained, until the end of her long life, a passionate advocate for the principles embedded within the renewed charter, often speaking to younger diplomats, myself included on more than one occasion, about the lessons that period had taught her regarding the difference between institutions that maintained order through fear of exclusion and those that earned genuine cooperation through demonstrated fairness. I think of that first day often, even now, so many years removed from the moment I stood in that observation gallery and watched a single human woman walk through ancient crystalline doors without a trace of the deference the assembly had always demanded from newly encountered species. I think of the fear that rippled through that chamber, the genuine uncertainty about what her arrival might mean for the careful balance of power that centuries of tradition had constructed. The galaxy did gaze in horror that day, just as the old accounts describe it, but I have come to believe the horror was never truly about humanity itself, about some inherent threat posed by their strength or their willingness to defy established custom. The horror, I think, was born from something considerably more uncomfortable to confront. It was the sudden, unavoidable recognition that the order we had all assumed was permanent, the hierarchy we had built our entire understanding of civilization upon, had never actually been as solid as we believed. It had simply never been tested by a species both capable and willing to walk away from it entirely, until the day humanity finally did. What followed was not the collapse so many had feared in those first uncertain weeks. It was, instead, something closer to a long overdue reckoning, one that ultimately left the assembly stronger and more genuinely representative of the species it served, precisely because it could no longer rely on quiet exclusion and careful hierarchy to maintain its authority. I do not know whether humanity fully understood, when Captain Marsh first stepped through those ancient doors, exactly how far the consequences of that single afternoon would eventually reach. I suspect, given everything I later learned about the careful, patient calculation that had shaped their entire approach to the assembly, that they understood considerably more than most of us gave them credit for at the time. But I know this. The galaxy that emerged from that reckoning was different from the one that existed before humanity arrived, and though the transition asked difficult questions of institutions and species alike, questions many would have preferred never to confront, I have come to believe, across the long years of my own career that followed, that it was a difference for the better. The assembly still stands today, its chambers still crowded with delegates from across known space, still governed by principles first written down millennia ago, by founders who could never have anticipated the day a single human warship would arrive, unannounced and unafraid, and force an entire civilization to finally examine the true foundations of the order it had built. I was there, in that gallery, the day it happened. I have spent the rest of my life trying to understand exactly what I witnessed. I am not certain I have fully succeeded, even now. But I know this much with complete certainty. Nothing about how our galaxy understood strength, or respect, or the true meaning of cooperation between different peoples, remained quite the same after that single, unforgettable afternoon. And somewhere, still, across the vast expanse of settled space, I imagine there are other species watching, other quiet observers wondering whether their own moment of reckoning might one day arrive, whether they too might someday find the courage to walk through doors that have never truly welcomed them, and simply refuse, at last, to wait any longer for permission that should never have been required in the first place.